The views and opinions expressed on this program are those of the participants and do not reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
BronxNet. Your voice, your views, your vision.
Good evening and welcome to Bronx Talk. With a new mayor and city council poised to take office in 2 weeks, United Neighborhood Houses, which has a membership of 38 settlement houses and community centers across the city, including a number in the Bronx, has published a blueprint for neighborhoods, which is this document, a new approach and so-called broader vision on education, healthcare, housing, and safety. Our plan tonight is to analyze this blueprint as a way of preparing us for the next era in New York City. If you'd like to comment on what you hear or have your own ideas for your neighborhood in the next edition of New York City government, then tonight is the night to talk about it. You call in at 718-960-7241 or email questions or comments to us at bronxtalk@hotmail.com, and we'll read those on the air during a future edition of our program. But for now, the former executive director of the South Asian Youth Action Committee and also the UNH Director of Policy and Advocacy, it's Annetta Seecharran. Good evening. Thank you for joining us. And the Development Director of BronxWorks, which recently won a prestigious award for management excellence, our old friend Ken Small. Nice to have you, Ken.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. Ms. Seecharran, let's start with this blueprint for neighborhoods. What is it and why?
Great. So the Blueprint for Neighborhoods is a set of policy recommendations for the next mayor to help him create greater equality in New York City. Mm-hmm. And so why a blueprint for increasing the equality in New York City? Mm-hmm. New York City is facing the greatest inequality it has in decades. Nearly 50% of the city's residents live near or below poverty line. And in fact, the Bronx is the hardest hit neighborhood. And you may also know that in America, nationally, we are experiencing the greatest inequality that we have since 1928.
You know, if I can just interject, one of the notes right up at the front is a baby born on Manhattan's Upper East Side, which is the nation's wealthiest congressional district, has a life expectancy of a full 4 years higher than one born in the South Bronx, which of course is the nation's poorest congressional district. To me, it underscores a lot of what you're saying, but go ahead.
Yeah, so New York City has the greatest inequality in our country. Mm-hmm. And for such a supposedly prosperous city, this is absolutely unacceptable. Mm-hmm. And so we saw this opportunity of a new mayoral administration after 12 years of the same mayor as a watershed moment to put forth a vision for a better New York City, for one that includes all of its people and allows all of its people to enjoy the prosperity and to participate fully.
Let's talk just briefly about UNH and what it is, and so that people, because we are going to break this thing down and go through it in a way point by point. Who are the people that you deal with? I talked about the 38 centers, settlement houses throughout the city, but who are the people that you really focus on, and what do your agencies do in the borough of the Bronx?
So our 38 member agencies collectively serve 500,000 vulnerable New Yorkers, and those are older adults, those are children, those are adults who may not be literate, those are immigrants. There are people across the city who rely on the services of a neighborhood-based organization in order to live their lives. Collectively, our members employ about 10,000 individuals. So we are truly a force both economically in the city and also in terms of keeping neighborhoods safe, stable, and strong. And so our members are at the front line of what's happening in neighborhoods across the city.
Well, I'll give you two things. One is the notion of 10,000 employees is interesting, and it's connected to the second part of what I want to say, and that is we know that certainly in recent history, organizations, and I could list some of them in the Bronx, Kingsbridge Heights Community Center, Marshall Montefiore Community Center, you know them more off the top of your head, but those are the kinds of organizations that we're talking about, and they have been starved economically in an increasing way through the last 12 years and maybe even beyond. So it's interesting to think not only if you put funding into these agencies, will you be assisting some of these social programs, but you may even be putting more people to work.
Absolutely.
I hadn't thought of that.
Absolutely.
See that? No day is lost if you learn something. Ken Small, first of all, congratulations to you and to BronxWorks. Won a 2013 Nonprofit Excellence Award, honored for superb management by New York Community Trust. Tell me, and we've talked for years over the many things that you do over there at BronxWorks, but where is BronxWorks at now, and what are you most proud of that you won this award?
BronxWorks, I think, is at a rather interesting juncture in its history. We just wrapped up literally a year of celebrating 40 years of BronxWorks being a Bronx-based nonprofit organization, being on the front line. And Gary, as you may know, Carolyn McLaughlin, who had been our executive director for 34 years, retired this past June. So right now we are actually in the midst of looking for a new executive director. In the meantime, Eileen Torres, who has been our general counsel for about 17 years, has stepped in an interim capacity. So the organization continues to function, we continue to operate, we continue to be a strong entity, and we continue to do our best to meet the many challenges that face Bronx residents.
Give me an example of the type of person, and I realize there's no one type because the Bronx is so diverse and what you do is serve so many diverse people, but who are the kinds of people who you serve every day? And then the next question, we're going to roll up our sleeves and talk about the Bronx.
It's a little bit hard to give you a composite in terms of who BronxWorks serves, but let me just say that on a typical day, there'll be anywhere from 2,500 to 3,000 people that BronxWorks will engage. Over the course of a year, we'll engage somewhere in the neighborhood of 35,000 people. We literally cover the gamut in terms of age ranges, so we start with the very young, and we also serve folks on through into their golden years. And about a third of the folks that we serve are new Americans, immigrants. And we kind of take pride in being the organization that in many ways is what, if you look at the settlement house tradition, it's what the Lower East Side settlement houses were doing back at the turn of the 20th century, in the 1920s, in the 1930s. We've kind of become that for the Bronx in terms of engaging the emerging population groups.
Ms. Seecharran, a lot of what you have in the blueprint and a lot of the dialogue, frankly, in the city, when we moderated a number of the council debates and all that, everybody said, well, let's put more funding into this, let's put more funding into that. So, and we're going to talk about some things that you would like to see more funding in. Where does this money come from? Very good question.
It's a very good question, but I'll say that's not our job.
Okay. So
that is the job, that's why we elected this mayor, to find the necessary resources in order to do what's right for New York City.
So whether it be raising taxes or cutting up, resectioning the pie in a different way, you're saying you're trying to put these things up and make them a priority.
Absolutely. And what I'm also saying is that the budget is a reflection of values and priorities. And if the city budget does not adequately fund human services, then to me it says something about our city's priorities. So it's wonderful that we have a mayor-elect who has actually won an election on a platform towards fighting inequality in the city. And so we hope that
He's going to make good on that promise.
exactly.
Well, let's go. Let's go right into it. One of the items is support quality educational investments that prepare all young people for a productive future. And right headlining this thing is child care and early childhood education and after-school programs. And I will tell you both, in the 19 years that I have been doing this program, the one thing that I hear from parents more often than anything else, I need something for my kids to do. When we talk about safety and security, when we talk about education, they said, if only my youngster had something more to do. And instead of increasing the amount of funding and attention and resource we put into after-school programs, we have, since I've been sitting in this seat, we've been decreasing them.
Yep.
So, you obviously want to expand them. Talk to me about some of the points. One of the issues was caseworker load. I thought that was fascinating that we have caseworkers that deal with children and those kinds of things, but they're overburdened, I guess, is what the bottom line is.
When we talk about quality education, we're talking about two main areas. One is that, the first one is that every young child from toddler to age 5 should have access to early childhood education or childcare, right? Currently, only half of all the city's 4-year-olds have access to pre-K. So there are 100,000 kids who do not have access to pre-K. Secondly, what we're talking about is that every young person in this city, middle schooler and high schooler, should have access to after-school programs. That is currently not the case. Thirdly, we're talking about improving our public schools. The data is abysmal for New York City's public schools. And so in that area of quality education, that's specifically what we mean.
What role can UNH and all the settlement houses play in delivering those services? I mean, I know that you run many of the Beacon after-school programs. I mean, you would just like to manage more of these programs, or do you have ideas? Look, it may not be about us, it may be about just those programs in general.
It's not about us. This visionary document that we put out is about the entire city and the entire system. Certainly our members would benefit from better investment in these programs. And I can tell you that any one of our members would say that they are not fully meeting the need of their neighborhood on any one of the human services, whether it's for childcare, after school, or senior services.
Ken Small, how bad is the need?
The need is tremendous. Gary, you talk about things like early childhood education, after-school programs, summer camp programs. I think the big issue is, to Annetta's point, making an investment that makes sense in terms of scalability. I think if you look throughout the settlement house system, there are lots of very good models in terms of how to provide early learning services, lots of very good models in terms of after-school and summer camp programs, lots of very good models in terms of services for youth and seniors. The big issue is having a critical mass of resources so that we can effectively respond to the need that's there.
This is number one on the list in the blueprint. Is it really and I mentioned it's been the top need that I've heard sitting in this seat. Is it really number one? Is this the first thing?
I think when you look at a lot of the data, a lot of the indicators in terms of education, the data tends to suggest that if you engage children very young, it increases the likelihood that they'll have positive outcomes.
It seems that you have a sympathetic ear from the mayor. He certainly has been talking about it. I mean, the question which you said you don't want to answer is where the funding comes from. That is something that's being currently debated. It seems that you have his ear. One of the things that comes up, and I'll ask both of you about it, we'll start with you, Ken Small, engaging the parents in the education, not only giving the youngsters various opportunities. How can we do that now? And I'm always sympathetic when I hear parents call up the show, and I meet, of course, people throughout the Bronx, and they tell me, you know what? both me and my husband, or my husband and wife, we're both working. Or sometimes, of course, there are single parents. We're working. I've got a couple of kids. It becomes more and more difficult. You're asking me not only to come home and feed them dinner and help them with their homework, but then get out and get to a PTA meeting or something like that. How can we engage parents in a fuller way in their kids' education?
Well, I guess in some ways it gets to the settlement house model in the sense that one of the things we look to do is to be flexible. So we look to work around whatever parents' availability is, whatever their scheduling is. And to your point, Gary, in terms of a lot of the activities that we undertake that engage parents, we look to engage parents either after work or on a Saturday. Oftentimes parents...
Find them when they can do it.
Parents are often looking for things to do with their children on
Did you want to respond to this?
I mean, I think what Ken says is absolutely right. The only thing I will add is that if people are really struggling to survive, it's very hard for them to think about how they're going to engage in their children's education. So I think it's a more comprehensive approach. I think that there are certainly tactics and strategies to better engaging parents. And that most certainly requires requires resources.
You know, one of the things you spend a lot of time with is this notion of language and language differences. How big a problem is that for parents? Because you make a point that more materials need to be in a wider variety of languages. He's shaking his head, yes.
I think it's significant. It's significant. It's one of the greatest barriers to parental engagement. I believe there's 1.8 million people in the city who are limited English proficient. There's a great need for investments in ESL.
And so you think, even without people saying it, this could be subliminally even a reason that they don't engage? Because it's like, gee whiz, I see this paper you brought home, but you know, frankly, I can't even understand what it is.
Absolutely. So it's not just language, there are also cultural barriers as well.
Let's talk about access to higher education. And I will tell you, and I know this for sure, the graduation rates at public colleges are in the single digits. So that means even if people get into many of our public colleges, and we have wonderful public colleges in the Bronx, they're not completing within the
6 years.
Well, it's taken 6 years. I meant 2 or 4 years for an associate's or bachelor's degree. You said you want $90 million for CBOs to do GED training. Is that what's needed? That more GED training? Is that where we're at right now?
GED training is about preparing individuals to enter the workforce, right? And in many cases for higher education. But if you have such a large number of people in the city who do not have this sort of fundamental education, it is very difficult for them to navigate life.
More so now than ever before,
Absolutely.
obviously. And especially if they do get into a public college, they find themselves, gee whiz, it takes me forever, and they really don't get the result that you want.
Yeah, and I think that connects to the second area of our policy recommendations, which is investing in supporting individuals in entering and staying in the workforce.
Ken Small, I'm going to ask you to keep rating. Where is this on the scale? How big a problem is this?
It's a major issue. And
major issue.
It's one of the things we see at BronxWorks, because we actually have a program that helps young people transition from middle school to high school, from high school to college. And what we find in terms of folks who have a GED, the transition process can present a lot of challenges because they've entered college through a non-traditional path.
So then they don't succeed in college.
Well, there's a combination of factors, and I think one of the big pieces that we often miss in the higher education equation is the lack of finance. So you've got a situation where lots of folks have the desire, lots of folks want to learn, but when it comes to funding that's available, Pell Grant money, TAP Grant money, it's not there like it used to be.
And so the glass ceiling is frankly at a very low level. I mean, if people just can't crack through
What happens is a lot of folks basically run out of financial aid, and that's why they wind up taking leave.
Well, of course, if you are in college for 6 years, you're bound to basically run out, or you're going to run up your tab, your loan tab, and you won't be able to deal with that. Our buddy Bob from Riverdale is calling in. Nice to have you with us, Bob. How are you?
Gary?
Do we have Bob?
Yes, Gary?
I'm not hearing him.
Hello?
I'm sorry, we'll find out in a second if we do have him. Go ahead. We don't have him?
Hello?
No, we'll move on.
Hello?
I don't hear him, though. So.
Hello?
There we go. Go ahead, Bob. I'm sorry.
Okay, Gary, can you hear me now?
Yep, they make it a little louder here, and I will hear you.
Okay. BronxWorks gets most of its funding from the City Department of Youth and Community Development,
Okay?
DYCD for short, which is federal money for youth, immigration, and senior services that come in block grants from DYCD through neighborhood advisory boards, if I'm not mistaken. Correct, Mr. Small?
Well, ask the question, and then we'll break it down.
As the former Neighborhood Advisory Board A chair, and I say former because of DYCD's redistricting of NABs, that it cut out certain areas, including areas of need like the Throgs Neck houses.
Okay, what's
I'd
the
like to
question?
know what Mr. Small thought of the redistricting by DYCD of zip codes and the elimination of certain areas in census tracts that are of need, but because of the zip codes, they are not allowed anymore to get DYCD funding.
Okay, so your question is?
It's what did he think of the redistricting
Got it.
that took out some areas of need that no longer will get funding from DYCD?
Got it. I'm going to add one more
Sure.
thing. I'm guessing, and I think it's a pretty educated guess, that the funding for all the UNH settlement houses, as well as BronxWorks, is a lot more complex than just saying that's where they get all their funding from.
That's
I think
true.
That's a safe comment. So some of the funding for some of the programs come from there, but I can tell you from talking to these kinds of people for years, none of these agencies can survive if they had one source of funding, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay,
Yeah.
so now we'll let you address the problem.
The Department of Youth and Community Development is a significant BronxWorks funder, and in terms of many of our neighborhood-based programs, it's a significant funder. There has been a change in terms of the NDA allocation process. That's not something that BronxWorks had any control over.
Right.
To the caller's point, the funding that he's referring to, neighborhood development area funding, that is federal funding that comes to us through a community service block grant. Here in New York City, the funds are managed by DYCD. I will say that it's taken a major struggle for organizations here in New York as well as around the country to see to it that the CSBG funding has been preserved. There had been talk at the federal level of eliminating that funding altogether.
Ms. Seecharran, this really cuts to the bottom line, and the bottom line is all those sources need to put all these issues on their priority list, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, that's really the bottom line,
Yeah.
and then we wouldn't be having this conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's unfortunate that we have a situation where there are neighborhoods that are in great need of investments in basic programs, whether it's youth or senior services,
Right.
that are pitted against other neighborhoods. So they are, what we call pockets of poverty throughout New York City that have suffered in this sort of reallocation of how funding is distributed. But so, I mean, I think the root cause of the problem here is that human services in this city is inadequately funded.
How do we improve access to health care? One of the major suggestions in the blueprint is to operate, a lot of the health centers, or at least the access to health through schools. Is that possible? And then, of course, who would operate those school-based health services?
So because we are a federation of the settlement houses, we are speaking what nonprofits can do to partner with government in improving the lives of residents, right? So all of our recommendations have something to do with what our organizations or other nonprofits can do, and we think that nonprofits can continue to be great partners and providers of these services, including healthcare.
Is it something like you say, well, at least we have somebody to identify, even basic examinations, somebody to identify problems so that children and their families can be notified without necessarily delivering the health care in the school?
I don't know. I can't really speak to all the specific technicalities of it. What I will say is that that particular recommendation is a response to the fact that so many of our city's residents do not have access to preventive care.
Gary,
and schools and community-based organizations are effective touch points for community members.
Okay, I'll let you weigh in on it. Then a
Yeah.
final question about immigration. Go
I
ahead.
would say part of it also is folks having access to health insurance. And one of the things that BronxWorks now has is an Obamacare program.
An advisory program to...
No, we actually have
You
a
have a-
health benefit exchange
Oh, there you go.
navigator program that is designed to provide people with unbiased information regarding their health care options.
A very important thing to know, because there are many people who read about it in the paper and still don't know what to do. We're just about out of time. I want to just ask you, they talked about $25 million for immigrant integration, and you established at the outset that a third of the population that you serve is new immigrants. 25 million gets it done, and what kinds of things would you put that money toward?
I think $25 million is a good start. There's a lot that needs to be done in terms of the immigrant community, in terms of materials being published in languages that people speak. I think there's also a lot that needs to be done in terms of allowing folks to do things like gain a pathway to citizenship in this country, gain access to employment opportunities, avoid some of the struggles that we've had historically.
And I'm going to just jump in to conclude it, that if we don't do that, then all of these people tend to become a drain on the various systems that we claim we have no money for. So either we deal with it on the front end, there's my advocacy point,
Yeah.
or we don't. Annetta Seecharran, thank you so much.
Thank you.
From UNH. If anybody wants to read the blueprint, and I would certainly recommend you do it, and tell your elected officials that you want to get into it, it's unh.org. And Ken Small, thank you for doing such a great job at BronxWorks.
Thank you.
Folks, we talk about viewer emails. We got a very interesting email about our show with the borough president last week, which I'm going to read to you. The writer said it was a fascinating program, fascinating to hear the borough president expound at length about the allegedly inclusive process at the Kingsbridge Armory, and contrast that to the way the horrible Fresh Direct proposal was dropped out of the sky with exactly zero public input with a press release. And then she went on to write, he evaded the question about the embarrassing and illegal conduct of the self-appointed chair of Community Board 1, which is clearly on video for anyone to see, and instead relied on ad hominem attacks on an individual. And that came from Lydia Rivera. So we appreciate Lydia's input into our program, and if you have further comments and questions on anything you heard on tonight's show or anything going on in the Bronx, then you send them in an email to us at bronxtalk@hotmail.com, or post them on our Facebook page, and we'll read those on the air during a future edition of our program. Also, please become a fan of Bronx Talk on Facebook. You can see our archives at bronxnet.org, and you check out the Bronx Talk link on the bottom right navigation bar, and that way you can get into all of our archives. We'll be back next Monday night. We'll have a holiday show for you of one sort or another, and we'll see you at 9 o'clock Monday night. Thanks to Jane Filoro, our producer. Our director is Shirley Arrieta. Studio coordinator is Dina Valentin. We'll see you next week. Good night.
Thank you.